Hello there, it's Leandra from PaperArtsy and welcome to another of our YouTube videos. Today we're very excited to show you some brand new stamps that we've got from one of our new designers. These stamps come from Darcy and she's been doing some amazing stuff on our blog in the month of August and for the last semester while she's been a contributor. And so she wanted some heart stamps and we didn't have quite what she wanted, so she decided that it would be quite cool to design some. And this is what she's come up with, which is a really nice steampunk style set of stamps here, or two sets of stamps. So I'm just going to do quite a quick tag with them today. I haven't got anything particular in mind, so we'll see what happens, but I'm very keen to have a go at stamping some of these items into Grunge Paste to start off with. So we'll give that a go and then we'll see what happens from there. Okay, so I'm just going to start by putting a really thin layer of Grunge Paste around the edge of this tag. I'm kind of thinking that this is going to be what the main tag ends up eventually getting layered onto. So I just want to get a bit of texture on here and then start stamping around the edges. If you're going to stamp into Grunge Paste, you want to keep it quite thin, not too thick at all. And you need to spritz your stamp with a little bit of water because that acts as a release agent. So what I tend to do is put the water on there and then really sort of rub it into the stamp, down into the grooves, and then test it and see if it's the right depth of Grunge Paste. So I can see that I've got a little bit of texture, not everywhere because I have applied the grunge quite thinly. So I can either apply more grunge or just leave it like that. I might put a little bit more in a few areas, and I'm just going to slowly work my way around the outside of the tag. Now the cool thing about this is you can always come back and remove or add more grunge. So if you want the texture to be thicker than that, then just go over the top, put your Grunge Paste on a little bit thicker, and repeat until you're happy. And you can even use your finger to smooth it out if you want as well. So it's quite forgiving. Okay, now I'm sort of thinking that I don't just want cogs. I've got some other ideas I'd quite like to try on there. So we'll get a bit more up the top here. It is quite hot here today, so I do have to work fast because it is going to dry out quite quickly. So bear that in mind. And it's really only going to be the edges of the tags that end up eventually being seen, so I'm not too worried about the middle. Now I do like to contrast with a different stamp, so let's get a bit of something scripty going on. Oh, that looks quite good, doesn't it? And that means I want to balance that up this side as well. You see there, it looks possibly just slightly on the thick side where the Grunge Paste was just a little bit too thick, but everywhere else absolutely perfect. I quite like it. I'm not too worried. It's not too squidgy. So we'll put some more script over this side to balance that other side. Now I'm thinking what will happen with this is I'll come back and I will probably paint the whole tag black and then add some treasure gold to it as a layer. And we'll see if that's what ends up happening. And we've got a little corner down the bottom here that could do with a bit of script. Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to set that to one side and let that dry. So I'm starting by working on our grey board. This is a relatively new product for us. There's a few sheets in the bag and they're a really nice surface to work on. You can also use them for construction projects and stuff, and we do have them coming in additional sizes soon. So it's a nice, really nice product to work on, and if you're going to stamp on something, then the white side is ideal because it's a bit smoother than the regular chipboard on the grey side. I'm going to make a background using my easy background technique, which you will have seen in another video. And so I tend to start light and just splat the colours on, and the first part is just all about getting some coverage on your background. So I'm sort of starting with my lighter shades of blue and brown. I've got these real taupey, nice sort of beigey tones, and mixed with the blue they make quite a nice combination. So I'm just going to start with sort of these opaque ones and mix it up, try and put the darker colours towards the edges. But with paint, and because it's opaque, you can always come over the top, so it doesn't really matter how you apply it. You just want to keep switching it from colour to colour until you get the balance and the way you prefer it to look. If you're not liking it, always go back to your lighter tones, because they're the easier ones to knock it back with. This one's Stone. And it kind of depends what stamping you're going to do over the top as well, as to how much colour you want on there. So if you don't want loads of colour, then keep it quite light if you've got some complicated stamping. And as you start to get one layer of colour, you really need to go to sort of much smaller dots, so really tiny dots, because you don't really want to have quite so much paint on there, and it won't take as much paint to get the coverage that you want. Once you've base coated it, it's so much easier just to use a little bit of paint on each subsequent layer. This one's Beach Hut. So this is going to add a little bit more brightness to it, because Beach Hut is a translucent. It doesn't have the high coverage that the opaques have, so it's not going to cover to the same extent, but it just adds that bit of warmth and depth and brightness. And you can do the same thing perhaps with a touch of the South Pacific. If you're worried you've got too much, then tap it onto your craft sheet and then just bring it in from the edges. And if you want it to be softer, put it on, use the white side of the foam. It's almost like you're applying an ink around the edge. You can do that much softer using the white side of your foam. And I'm going to do that as well with the dark chocolate pudding. So I'm just trying to create sort of a shabby-ish background, okay, like that. And I'm just going to give it a quick dry, and then I'll sand it lightly to just blend all the layers together so it doesn't look quite so scratchy. And I like doing this because it exposes the edges. So when you start to use a sanding block, you sand back through all the layers. It makes your background just look a bit more blended. And it almost starts to look like a printed scrapbooking paper, because you sort of are raising back with your sanding block different layers and exposing some of the layers below. Now where we've got that really nice exposed card again around the edge, that's a great way to use one of your darker colours and to start framing. So I'm just getting a bit of paint onto the white. I'm just going to bring that in, and it will really stick to the edge of your piece of chipboard. So this is much the same as you would use an ink pad to grunge up the edges. But with paint, of course, this is going to be permanent. Depends on the ink pad you use as to whether you're going to end up with a permanent effect. If you use a pigment ink, you would get a nice permanent effect around the edge here, but if you use something like a distress ink, it doesn't matter what surface you put those on, they're never going to be permanent. So, because they're deliberately designed to be an unstable ink, and they're designed to bleed when water's added to the equation with a distress ink. So if you want your dark edge to be permanent, then you need to use either a pigment ink, a permanent pigment ink, or you could use a paint in the way that I just have. Okay, so we've created a background. The next step is to use some of Darcy's stamps onto this background. So I'm going to go back to the nice cog stamp, which is a really ideal background stamp, and also on this set here we've got fantastic heart sort of vine, and both of those are going to be really nice as background stamps. Now I'm going to start with the vine, and I think what I'll do is use a lighter colour paint to begin with, because it's quite nice using light paint, but I'm going to use this piece of cut and dry foam, because what will happen is some of the other colours of paint will tend to come through as well. So when I put it on to begin with, it's all going to look very sort of like stone. Let's see. But as I apply subsequent layers of paint, I'll get some of the other colours coming through, and that can create a nice effect. See, it's starting to go a bit blue on the edges of that vine. Okay, so I'm just adding a little bit of interest on there. It's very subtle because I've used the same colours in the background, so where I've got the light on top of the dark it really pops, but where it's stone almost on top of stone it's a lot more invisible. But that's nice because it gives you a bit of contrast. So let's do a similar thing with the cog stamp, and this time we'll go to one of the darker bluey colours. Let's try a bit of the South Pacific. So you just tap the paint onto the stamp and then apply straight onto your background, and it's just the same as using an ink pad, except you're inking up your stamp with paint instead of ink. Okay, so you get that showing really nicely on top of the light areas, and it's not so bold on the dark areas, so the complete opposite of what we had happen the first time round with the other colour. Clean your stamps with paint. It's just a good idea to give them a bit of a spritz with water, and that makes sure that the paint stays nice and damp on there. And if you haven't got time to clean them immediately, then it gives you a longer time to come back and clean them. Or the other thing you can do is just sit a baby wipe on top of them like that, and then stack them up and come back and clean them later. But again, it's keeping them damp for a little bit longer. You can see the paint's already starting to come off when you, as long as you've kept it damp. So it's over to you, whether you clean now or later. It just gives you that little bit of time to think about it. So the next step with this is to just stamp a feature stamp on here and then decide what we're going to do from there. So I'm really keen to put this large heart image onto the tag. So I've made sure that the tag is nice and dry, and then it's just a matter of inking it up and stamping it on. Now this heart you want to make sure it's square on your block. So if you use the zip going down to the bottom of the fleur-de-lis sort of construction down the bottom there, you can use that and line it up with the side of your block so that when you turn it over you know that it's going to work on your tag in the right orientation. VersaFine or archival is ideal onto paint. I tend to use archival when I'm demonstrating because it's a bit faster to dry. But when I'm doing it in my own time, I generally, if it's a fine detail stamp, will use VersaFine. Okay, so I'm going to pop that one there. It's always cool when you see a new stamp. And then I really like this quote down the bottom here. So again, I've lined up the quote onto the index, onto the block, using the very edge of the block to make sure that sort of the lines are straight. And then it's a good idea, if you're not sure, you can always test. So let's just test it first. So if you get a piece of paper and then use the straight edge of your acrylic block, line the straight edge of your acrylic block up with the paper, and then you can see if you think that's sitting straight. Okay, I'm going to then stamp that across the top here. So the same logic. So there's the quote on there. If you want the quote to stand out a little bit more, then you could always whitewash before you stamp it. But that's okay, I'm happy with that. Right, so next stage is we need to add some colour to the heart and perhaps some of the little trailing swirly bits around the edge. So before I colour this in, I do need to thoroughly dry it. So this is archival ink. It becomes permanent once it's heat set. And that is the same for VersaFine, it's the same for Brilliance. But it's never the same for a distress ink. If you stamped in Distress Black Soot, even once you've heat set it, it is still not permanent. As soon as you introduce water, like we're going to by colouring in, then the distress ink would just bleed everywhere. So you do need to use a permanent ink if you're intending to colour in with paint. So I'm going to use blood orange, and first of all we'll just water it down a little bit. But here's a tip: if you want the colour to show up a bit more on the background, then do a wash of white to begin with. So I'm just getting a really thin wash of the white snowflake, and I'm going to pop that over here. But I am not going to go anywhere near the black lines because this is opaque, and if I go near those black lines I will purely hide the stamping, so I don't want that to happen. So I need to just be very careful that I go close to the lines but not over them. So spreading that out a little bit, and then I'm just going to blend it right towards the edges here. So by putting a whitewash of this down first, what will happen is when we come over the top with the red, it will pop a little bit more than just putting it straight on top of that blue. Because of course you can imagine red on top of blue is going to give you a kind of a purple colour. And we don't really want that. Right, so I need to clean my brush thoroughly because it's got an opaque colour in there. So I need to get rid of that. And then we're moving on to the translucent blood orange. So have your paper towel nearby, blot off the excess, and then just start applying the colour. And this time you can go right over the top of everything because it's a translucent. So I'm just going to pull this right over the whole heart. And you kind of want to build up a few layers of the paint, ideally. Now I'm just going to leave that zip so that that sort of stands out. That's the little background bit behind the zip. And then I'm just going to keep adding layers. Now you can dry in between. I seem to be knocking everything over today. You can dry in between your layers, or you can continue to just work your way around with the wet, because it does seem to sort of dry quite quickly anyway. Now let's just see if I can blend this out a little bit. So I'm just getting more and more water on the brush and softening this out. I'll do the same around the other side. Take off the excess off the brush and then soften it back a bit. So see, you can sort of remove, if you've got your brush damp, you can kind of remove it and create that whole shadow thing. And keep going with your layers in lots of water. And each layer you add, you will get more depth of colour. So you can just sort of, by cleaning off your brush and wiping it back, you can kind of remove paint as well, which creates a sort of a highlight point. Okay. Now if you add another red to that, you'll also create a more interesting colour. So if we get a bit of London Bus and water that down, which is a brighter red, you can come over the top and add depth, or even you could do this with smoked paprika as well. It just makes it a little bit brighter. Might not be good, the camera might not pick up the difference in this because it is pretty subtle. But because that's a redder, more sort of primary red, the colour of the London Bus, it adds this, you know, much a bigger sort of deeper brightness to it. Okay, so that's the heart, and suddenly that just pops off the background a whole lot more than it was. And I would probably add a few little bits of interest. I mean, you could even do it in the same colour. Might be easier. I need a finer paintbrush. Oh, I've got a flat instead of a point. Not quite the right paintbrush for the job. But that's just really watery paint, and just by doing that makes those little flourish trails come to life a bit more. So that's quite soft and subtle, but you can keep adding your layers. So once it's dry, go back and add another layer. Right, so then for that it just needs to sort of sit on the background that we made earlier. Okay, so we've gone back to the grunge paste that we started with on the first tag, and I'm going to paint it with a mixture of blood orange and French roast. You get quite an interesting effect if you mix in a translucent into the sort of darker colours, but you do have to work this right into all the texture from the grunge paste. So I was just going to start with a bit of that first, and then the red I'll pick it up as I go around. I'm going to use a bit of treasure gold on top, so you kind of want, if you want your treasure gold to really pop, then a nice dark background is going to look great. Just have a quick squiz at how that looks. So we've got a little bit of red down there. We might want to have a little bit more somewhere else, but we'll just let that dry first. Give it a zap. So when you mix those two colours, I don't know if you can sort of see, perhaps you get a really nice mahogany sort of shade in the tonings, which is going to go quite nicely with the other background. Sometimes as you start to dry it, you get little white bits appear, so you can sort of go back and touch them up if you want with your damp paintbrush, but because we're putting treasure gold over the top of this, it's probably not overly important because treasure gold itself is an opaque. But it does need to be dry before you start to put treasure gold on there. So I've decided I'm going to go with onyxite and ruby. Onyxite is quite a chocolatey sort of colour treasure gold. It's really pretty. And I just need a paper towel. So if I get rid of the excess, it's always quite hard when you first pick it up, you're never quite sure how much you're going to have on there, and I prefer to sort of go lighter than heavier because I'd really like some of the paint to show through. But this really picks up the texture quite quickly with the smallest amount of treasure gold. So you can see your little steampunky, and it catches in the light. Now ruby, let's try a bit of ruby over here. That's pretty cool. And it just gives a nice little glint. See, it's just going to show through. You still get your paint, but it's nice to have that little glint at the edges. So it's over to you how much you put on. You might just want to rub it along the edge like that and have a very small amount, or you might want to go a bit more OTT, bit heavier application, or do a bit of both. But when you end up with sort of lumps and bumps in your grunge paste, that's where the treasure gold really comes into its own. You really start to see the texture so much better when you put a metallic on top. And this is treasure gold is a metallic wax, and you can see it's very, very soft, and a little goes a really long way, so you don't need very much of it. And it's a bit like paint. If you apply it 2 coats, you're going to get a much more strong, true colour than if you just have 1 coat. And you probably, I hope you can see this on the camera, that as I apply a 2nd coat of that ruby, it's really starting to pop. You can see it against the paper towel there. So let's go back to our onyxite. And I don't change or clean my brush in between. I just dip my brush straight back into the pot. I just love this onyxite. It is like a proper chocolate. It's a beautiful colour. And it's really nice with onyx light if you mix it with a lighter colour like classic or brass, one of those lighter tones. You can create a lighter brown, lighter chocolate colour. You don't have to apply it with a brush, you can easily apply it with your finger, or you can do both. I just find if I apply it with a brush, I can kind of skate it or skim it over the top, and then it doesn't go down into the dips. If I put it on with my finger, for some reason, straight from the pot, it tends to go down in all the dippy bits straight away, which I don't really want to have happen all the time. Right, so I'm going to give that a bit of a dry. It's so tempting to just quickly bring it over the whole tag, all the treasure gold, so that you can see all the grunge paste texture, because it does look amazing the more treasure gold you add onto these sorts of textured bits. Oh, let me just show you. It's just that we're not actually going to see the middle of the tag that much, so at all. It almost ends up looking like an old piece of leather or an old book or something. It's really, this is really in keeping with the theme of Darcy's stamps. Okay, so that's going to go on there. Now I probably need to add a little bit of darkness around the edge of this. So the easiest way is to use a dark paint around the edge. I think I might get a bit of black. So, piece of foam has disappeared. Oh, here we go. Here's one. See, just make that edge. I really want to sort of hide all those grey edges at the side of the board there. And just by using the black, it matches with the black of the stamped image, so it makes the whole thing stand out a little bit more. So as I've got less and less paint on there, I get a little bit more confident to pull some of that black through into the centre, so it just grunges it up that little bit. Not everywhere, just sort of random places. So that when that sits on top of there, you see that's a lot more in keeping now. Now the other trick with the black paint is you can also apply it over the top of treasure gold. Treasure gold is sometimes you might want to just knock it back a little bit, but I kind of want to have a dark edge around the edge of this in the same way that I've got a dark edge around the edge of the tag. So with those last little bits of paint on there, I just slightly grunge that up a bit at the edges. Okay, and then that would get sat on top of there. So you could easily add another embellishment. It might be quite nice. Darcy's got some really cool other little embellishment stamps on here. So I probably, once the video is finished, I might add another little embellishment to it, perhaps using a similar background with those tones, like the key would look fantastic, or even the butterfly would look really good as an embellishment somewhere in here too. So that's probably what I would continue to do. So thanks for joining us, and thanks to Darcy for these new sets of stamps. They're fantastic, and we look forward to seeing you again next time on the PaperArtsy YouTube channel.